we're now going to move on in a seamless transition to Dr. Tay Sheraton, our Honorary Membership Secretary, who's going to lead us through the Wellbeing session. Over to you, Tay.
Morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be chairing this session on wellbeing, which is obviously a core work stream of the association. And we've got three fabulous speakers. Our first speaker has been all over the BBC yesterday, Professor Neil Greenberg, and has published recently in occupational medicine that's got a lot of talk. We've got a recording of his talk, but he will be with us at the end to take questions. So without further ado, if we could have Professor Neil Greenberg's talk.
Hello, my name is Neil Greenberg, and I'm going to speak to you on how to maintain staff wellbeing in the face of adversity. You can see a picture there of King's College London, which is where I'm based. And you can also see my Twitter handle down at the bottom there. If you're interested in Twitter, please do follow me. I push out all our academic papers on that when they come out. So my background is that I'm a psychiatrist. I chair the Royal College of Psychiatrists Special Interest Group in Occupational Psychiatry. Served in the military for years, and I run a small little company and see lots of patients. And also have done a lot of stuff over the last year with the NHS Wellbeing team and the Recovery Commission. In terms of sources of information for what I'm going to speak about, you can see a variety of sources there. Most of our papers are downloadable, particularly those from the Health Protection Research Unit, which are particularly relevant to the current talk, and also from the King Centre for Military Health Research, where a lot of our research comes from. So in terms of threats to the mental health of NHS staff, it's worth being aware that they come in lots. Trauma is unfortunately part of many NHS staff's job. So, that's not just in terms of intensive care, but also in terms of dealing with a whole wide range of health threats. Workload and shift patterns outside of trauma can also cause a lot of difficulties. Lots of evidence initially from the early stages of COVID from Wuhan in China, showing that actually staff who work shorter shifts have much better mental health than staff who work shifts, and that pattern is repeated across the world. We can't forget also that home life stressors make a big impact upon people's mental health. So if you've got relationships, children, and the like, then absolutely those problems also come into work as well. And so it's important to look at workplace stress, but also to remember that home life is a big source of. And there's this issue of what we call moral injury, which is basically being put in a situation where moral can be because of acts of commission, so things that you do, acts of omission, things that you don't do or other people don't do, and also feeling betrayed by a higher authority. That means being let down by people who really should know better, or people who you feel should be out there to protect you. And whilst moral injury is not a mental health problem by itself, we know that it predisposes people to suffer with mental health difficulties, and it's an important topic. So in terms to protect the psychological resilience of NHS staff, there are a number of different ways of doing this, and I'm going to put this into prepare, sustain or maintain, and then recover. So in terms of preparing staff, it's really important that before people get into the psychological tasks, that they properly consider if they're psychologically ready for the role. And that might be that actually there's stuff going on at home which makes them a bit more vulnerable at the moment. It might be that actually they feel pressured to go into the role by other people and they're not really ready. Forcing people to do things which inevitably are going to lead to them having mental health difficulties. And that means giving them frank, preparatory information about what they could do. So it's always, well, we really want to do this important task. But if they don't know what the psychological impact task then that can cause problems. I worked running the mental health strategy for the London Nightingale Hospital in 2020 when it set up for the few weeks it was in operation then as a hospital in London. And what we tried to do is to say to staff, what you're going to do is really important. That people are going to die, it's going to be hot, it's going to be difficult, communication is going to be tough. And we tried not to sugarcoat what was going on so people can make a valid, informed choice about whether they're right to do that tasks. Also talked about something called psychological PPE. And these are processes that you can try and put in place before people become distressed, which might help protect their mental health. And one specific example of that is what's called a wellness recovery action plan. And that basically means writing down or making a plan of the things that will keep you well normally, so that when you become distressed, you can turn back to that plan and make use of it. We also know that training people to do their job properly makes a huge difference. Lots of evidence from the military, emergency services, that people who don't feel properly prepared for their role are more likely to have difficulties. One thing that doesn't work is psychological health screening. And so what we know is you can't use, psychiatrists or psychologists or psychometric tests to predict who's going to have problems. This was a study published in 2020 looking at psychological health screening to predict vulnerability in Australian police. And they followed people up for 7 years after they joined the police, having given them a good psychological screen beforehand, and they found that the screen predicted absolutely nothing. So the idea that you can use sort of psychometrics or interviews to predict who's going to have problems doesn't work. And the difficulties is it gives you false reassurance that people are going to be okay when they're not. And also it can be quite discriminatory. When people are doing the work, we know that social support makes a big difference. So you should really aim to buddy people up on shifts. So Peter, Sandra, I want you to do your job, but also to check in with each other. Make sure that people are encouraged to speak to each other about what's going on. Because although social support is really important for mental health, often it's not well used because people are sort of afraid to sort of talk to other people about what's going on because they feel they're busy. One thing we know makes a huge difference is having supervisors who really understand about mental health. But there's very strong evidence that having what we call a psychologically savvy supervisor who feels that they can talk about mental health can make a huge difference to mental health, and also a huge difference to people's propensity to seek help. Evidence from a variety of sources, emergency services and military, show that actually if you have a supervisor who is supportive and can speak about mental health, that can lead to 1/10 of the rate of mental health problems compared to a supervisor who doesn't. We ran these REACT training courses for the NHS. These are 1 hour courses, 1.5 hour courses, which aim to teach people using Zoom or Teams how to have these psychologically savvy chats with their staff. And it was a bit of didactic teaching, but mostly it was getting people to look at how it's done and to practice it over an hour. And what we found is, doing a brief evaluation, is before attending that training, less than half the supervisors, NHS supervisors, felt confident to support their colleagues. Having completed it 1 month later, over 80% felt confident. So for a small bite-sized piece of training, we were able to dramatically increase the confidence of supervisors to speak to their staff, which we know will have an impact on their mental health. Another thing is, at the end of a shift, rather than letting people just disappear, is they should have a quick review, a quick check-in with their supervisor or with a colleague if not. And one way that this is sometimes termed is a check-up from the neck up. So to see how people are doing, what's going on in their head, are they ready to go home, reorientate them towards home and away from work and let them go on and get on with their lives. But that's a quick check-in to see that if people are having difficulties as a result of the shift, then you want to do something early on. Lots of evidence out there for peer support, and there's a range of different peer support packages that are available. And I'm not going to say which one's the best or which one's the worst. They've all got strengths and weaknesses. Trauma risk management, psychological first aid, mental health first aid are examples of 3 of them. What's important about peer support packages is that the people who are peer supporters are properly trained. They've completed a course. They're not just people who want to do good, but they're people who actually have had some training in how to speak to people who might have some sort of distress. That training also needs to be in date. So if they did something peer support training sort of 5 years ago, that's great, but it doesn't mean that they're capable of doing that sort of peer support now. And really importantly is they need to be supervised. What we don't want are peer supporters who are trying to help colleagues who are distressed, picking up a lot of that distress themselves, often called vicarious trauma or secondary stress, and then becoming unwell themselves. And we also don't want peer supporters, going off track and sort of saying things and doing things that really aren't part of the peer support package. But lots of good evidence that peer support done well improves social support. It improves help seeking and also improves people's capacity to stay at work. And we've done a number of studies looking at peer support, which is generally a good thing if it's trained, in date and supervised. Another approach which we know makes a big difference is to use the principles which are called the PIES principles. And this is often called forward mental health support, started in the military, but has huge amount of applicability to NHS and other high pressure settings. And I'll just run through what those principles are in a second. But it's worth saying that a good study done by the Israeli military as a result of the first Lebanon War, which was 1982, is they had a lot of casualties there, stress casualties, people who really failed to function. And what they found is the more these PIES principles put in place at the time that someone was suffering with acute distress, the better their outcome was 20 years later on. And as you probably know, you don't get many 20-year follow-up studies. So that was really strong evidence. So P stands for proximity. And what proximity means is that if someone's having a difficulty at work, don't just say, go home, come back when you can. All the evidence is that you need to keep people somewhere close to where the difficulties occurred. You need to reduce their pressure a little bit, and you need to increase their. In the First World War, the phrase was within the sound of our own guns. And I think these days it will be keep them within the sound of our own machines or our own mobile phones or computers or devices or the like. So keep people proximal to where they have difficulty and support them whilst they're doing that. The next principle is the principle of immediacy. And what that says is that gradually people become affected by stress. And actually they may gradually go downhill and they may not even realize that actually they've been affected. And then something small happens, often what's called the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then they appear to kind of fall apart. And everyone's kind of wondering why that is, because normally the person is pretty resilient, and this small thing seems to have thrown them off their perch. And the reason is that they've been going gradually downhill for a while and no one's done anything about it. So the immediacy principle says that if someone appears not to be their normal self or has some difficulties, try and nip it in the bud. Try and have a conversation with them, one of those psychologically savvy conversations, and try and find out what's going on, because solving a problem earlier on is much more effective than waiting until people get into a crisis. Expectancy says that actually, if you're working in a difficult healthcare setting, there's lots of patients, there's lots of pressure, there's long shifts, and you know what, you're not sleeping ideally, and you're feeling a little bit distressed at times. The expectancy is that actually that's pretty normal, actually. It doesn't mean you're ill. It doesn't mean that it won't get better. It doesn't mean that you're doomed forever to have mental health difficulties. So the expectancy is that having some symptoms is quite okay. Of course, the expectancy also should be is that if those symptoms do get worse, if they do start to impair your ability to do your job and they don't get better, then the expectancy should be within the team that we're going to get you to get some professional help. And then the last principle is the principle of simplicity. And what that means is that if people are having a tough time and they're stressed because they don't know the right technique at work or the right procedure or how to use a bit of kit, they don't need a mental health professional. What they need is someone to show them how to do their job properly, to mentor and supervise them. So simplicity says try and fix the problems that cause the distress rather than just focusing on how bad things are if you can. Now, one thing you won't see there is the use of psychological debriefing. And this is a nice slide, National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And what NICE are very clear at saying is there is no role for psychological debriefing or psychologists or counselors or psychiatrists to come in and try and make people's mental health better in the workplace. The evidence is that when you try and do that after traumatic events, not only does it not work, it actually stands the chance of making people worse. And so NICE specifically say, do not do psychological debriefing, because that's not a good thing. And then when people get a chance to begin to think about recovery, make sure that they get a proper thank you. I know it sounds a bit facile, but actually the evidence is that a good thank you makes sense of what's happened to them. Make sure they don't just go straight back into another busy job, give them a chance to reconnect with others. Really important, once again, that those supervisors speak to people who have been having a tough time, because as well as finding out what's happened at work, and they should know something about that, they're their supervisor, you need to find out also about what's also happened at home. What else has gone on that might be affecting their mental well-being? And if you don't ask, then you won't know. You need a bit of time for reflection and meaning making. Those are ways of trying to get around those moral injuries. What does this all mean for me? Was it all my fault? Was I let down? Well, and that needs to be talked about in a team with people that you trust in an open and honest way that doesn't lead to you feeling victimized or blaming others. Keep an eye on people, active monitoring, and then make sure they get, if they need it, timely access to evidence. We know there are lots of good treatments out there for mental health problems. The difficulty sometimes is getting people to those treatments. And so, employer, we need to make sure that people get there soon before they lose their self-esteem and their relationships and indeed even their jobs. So overall, the conclusions of my talk is do not over-medicalise normal distress. Try and nip it in the bud and build team support. Really important to have psychologically savvy supervisors who can speak about mental health. Have forward mental health support, those PIES principles. Make sure you give people a proper thank you, help them get back to work gradually and have a chance to reflect about what's going on, and keep an eye on people. And if they need professional help, make sure they get to evidence-based care when they need it. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Neil Greenberg there. It was really good to hear about the scientific evidence behind wellbeing, and I certainly learned a lot from that session. I have great pleasure now in introducing Dr. Anna Baverstock, who's from the Somerset NHS Foundation Trust, paediatrician and lead doctor for wellbeing and trust-wide wellbeing, team strategic leader. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I first became interested in wellbeing, or aware of wellbeing, 19 years ago when I was pregnant with my daughter, Poppy. And I was a paediatric registrar in Bath, running a really busy unit, covering ED, deliveries and the ward. And within the space of a week, looked after 3 children and babies who subsequently died. And I was clearly really traumatised by this. And I spoke to my educational supervisor, and we reflected that actually it was really challenging. What was really interesting is around the same time in the BMJ, there was an orthopaedic surgeon that wrote that whether an orthopaedic surgeon should continue to operate if they'd had an intraoperative death. And so she and I, Fiona Finley and I, my supervisor, got to thinking that actually if orthopaedic surgeons were worrying about their own well-being, perhaps we as paediatricians ought to do the same. And I was just reflecting this on coming to talk today in terms of what we're all facing and what you in anaesthetics and intensive care are facing and what our new normal is and how really challenging. For the last 18, 19 years, I've been thinking and talking about wellbeing, and I've been really interested in the increasing interest that there is around colleague wellbeing and burnout compared to originally. I think the important thing to say is there's absolutely no one size fits all. I'm clearly quite creative. I like drawing trees and I like thinking about things in a visual way. And I have some fabulous colleagues who are really good at sending me little pencils if I'm getting too artistic. My aim for today is that everyone has something that they can take away. So just thinking a little bit and building really on what Neil was saying, my very simple analogy for colleague wellbeing is to think of a battery. And for today's purposes, I'm thinking of it in a very 2D way. I'm not thinking about the capacity and the components, and there's some very interesting conversations to have around that. But we recharge as individuals, teams and systems, and we drain. And how can we ensure that our colleagues have prioritised their wellbeing? Because what we know from the evidence is that if we have good wellbeing, we improve patient safety, we provide kind, compassionate care, we improve the quality of care and reduce the errors, we improve communication and have less complaints. And the reason that big multi-tech companies like Microsoft and Google are so interested in colleague wellbeing is that we improve productivity and reduce cost. But more than that, how can we ensure that we have good wellbeing from the beginning of the shift to the end of the shift? And how do we make sure that we provide the same safe, high quality, compassionate care throughout the day? There's been so much written about what happens when we fall into the red, we become compassion fatigued, and we experience the triad of burnout, overwhelming exhaustion, cynicism and detachment, and feelings of ineffectiveness and accomplishment. And it's important to recognise that whilst the individual suffers burnout, it is truly a system issue. So many of you will be familiar with Simon Fleming, one of the orthopaedic registrars. I really like this visual analogy in terms of how are things today. So I would just ask you, how are you right now? What would your duck score be? And perhaps even more, in the last shift you did at work, where were you when you started and where were you at the end? Because I think it's really important that we do take time to check battery level through the shift And I guess my challenge to you is, how can we enable this to happen? What we know is that we can make changes for wellbeing as individuals, teams, but we know from the evidence that the better, more sustainable changes are made at the organisation and system level. And at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, the conversations was around, you know what, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and we've just got to make sure we keep going. Well, I would argue that no one has been able to do this as a marathon or as an ultra marathon. And we have all had to have time where we were able to hand the baton over and decompress. And I think, therefore, we need to think a bit more as a marathon relay so that we can hand it over. And we need to think about our wellbeing at home, even though obviously I'm concentrating on wellbeing at work for today. And I was watching the Tour de France earlier this year, and I appreciate this is an old photo from Team Sky, but Team Sky is a team of professional cyclists that start a peak endurance race in peak fit cycling shifts. They're offered full support in terms of nutrition. They take it in turns as leaders, and they sort of support each other psychologically. They then end their shift and they go back to the purpose-built team bus and then back to the hotel. So very, very early on, I was thinking, how can we kind of match that provision for colleagues across the trust, all colleagues? The Somerset Foundation Trust employs around 10,000 people across the acute community and mental health services. So it's a big, diverse trust. So we built up, thinking a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of the needs that we needed. And I'm just going to talk about a few of those today, because I appreciate that Neil and Fiona are talking about perhaps more of the emotional and psychological support and some of the reflective space. But I just wanted to acknowledge, and Neil also mentioned this, actually how important welcome is. And actually, I'm aware that lots of staff are being redeployed, and I would really, really just commend to you all how important it is to make sure that your new colleagues starting, particularly junior doctors starting on the units, good welcome. We're really good at doing leaving parties and thank you parties and retirement parties. How can we actually start to do welcome parties? That reflecting that it's okay to not be okay, and this is who's available to help, thinking about some inductions and thinking about mentoring and supervisors. And certainly that's something that we do at Musgrave. All new senior doctors are given a mentor, rather like we have a clinical or operational supervisor as a trainee. So, Guys and St Thomas has started the HALT campaign. Are you hungry, angry, late? And I've added lonely or tired. And I think these are really questions to ask ourselves and our colleagues through the day. And I would really think about, if you can create something visual with perhaps the duck score and that, I think it would be a really good way of doing a bit of a battery check. There's some fabulous resources in the Association of Anaesthetists Fight Fatigue. I don't need to tell you about that. But we were really interested in actually, can we change behaviour around breaks? So as part of our wellbeing conference last year, we did some workshops looking at breaks. And before the conference, and this was a group of doctors and nurses and some non-clinical staff as well, around 34% mostly or always took our break. And after the workshop, around nearly 87% intended to take their break. And then there was unsurprisingly a bit of a drop off, and that only 57% when we've been monitoring them since then are actually been able to. And we were really interested to look at the enablers and barriers to this. And the enablers were around scheduling in a break, around role modelling and making sure that we had senior role models around taking breaks, and also thinking about wellbeing space. And barriers, again, would not be a surprise to you. Putting self last, staff shortages, which I know is an acute problem at the moment, workload, that feeling that we just keep going until, and I guess my question is, until what? And then the lack of staff room. So we've been working really, really hard to try and get rid of the barrier of having a nice staff room. So we have spent some time revamping our mess. We're providing some hot food at night. And really important around the breaks is the sleep as well. So we've got bedrooms for everyone on nights and rooms for those on late shifts, because we have quite a lot of junior doctors who work in Bristol, which is around an hour's commute away. So the real overwhelming message is, do not drive home tired. And we're really encouraging colleagues to use exception reports to try and help with that. I think the other thing to say is that we've been trying to make as many pop-up wellbeing hubs as we can, because actually there's something about, if it's easy to just go and have somewhere where there's coffee available, where you can have a snack and to sit down somewhere nice, then you're more likely to do it. So actually, as trainings become more virtual, and we've had to convert, we've been able to create some sort of pop-up hubs, and I know we've been trying to do this in theatres as well. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the angry side as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Chris Turner's fabulous and colleagues' fabulous Civility Saves Lives campaign and project. And that's something that we're actively involved with locally as well. And we're doing a project where we're trying to increase the awareness of the importance of civility, not only related to colleague wellbeing, but also related to patient safety, but also to start having some braver conversations addressing the behaviour when it's witnessed. Because what we know from the Civility Saves Lives data is if someone is rude, then about 80% of us waste time worrying about that rudeness, or use time rather than waste. We reduce the quality of our work, 50% reduce the time at work, and we're much more likely to take it out on the next person we speak to. But actually, if I was rude to someone within this virtual space of people, then actually every single person who's witnessed that rudeness will also be affected. And I think if we think about the teams that we work in, this is really significant. We reduce our performance, 50% have to help others. So it's really important that we try and get this message across. Again, you guys have done some fantastic campaigning around Knock It Out, following on from the orthopaedic surgeon's Hammer It Out campaign. And I think what our training is trying to do is, if we've witnessed unprofessional behaviour, what we're hoping to do is to increasingly recognise it and then at least become an active bystander. If possible, try and have the conversation, but otherwise know who to delegate it to. And I just wanted to share a framework that I find really helpful. So this is based on Kim Scott's radical candor work, but I also really like to think as well. So Brené Brown talks about clear as being kind and unclear as being unkind. And I think often we shy away from having brave conversations because we're too worried about being nice, when actually what we need to do is think about being kind. So I've changed the labels on this graphic. So where we want to be is the northeast. We want to be high support, high challenge, having brave conversations with colleagues about these things, thinking about feedback. Where we don't want to do is to verge into the sugarcoat, where we're worried about upsetting people, so therefore we're not having the conversations in a brave framework. Perhaps some of us are better at being very upfront, and we tend to stab in the front, so we're having very challenging conversations without the support. But I think the conversations that we all need to avoid is where we're talking about someone rather than to someone. And so that is where we tend to be stabbing them in the back. And my challenge to you is that if you don't know about the elephant in the room, you just need to double check that you're not the elephant in the room. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour going through. And I just wanted to finish with a few thoughts. I haven't spent much time talking about time and space to reflect, because I know that Neil and Fiona are doing that. But we've had a really successful trial of using a Baylink group for our F1 doctors, which we're in the process of restarting. And I absolutely agree with Neil. I think it's about having a supervisor or a mentor or someone on the ground that you can have a psychologically savvy conversation with. And certainly on our medical wards and our medical teams, who at present are needing to care for patients with a range of COVID conditions that they're not used to, this is the area of support that we're having to adapt and use most, because we're finding particularly our nursing colleagues are really finding this difficult. And actually the senior colleagues within the wards that they would normally go to are finding it increasingly hard to have the reserves to support the other colleagues who they're with. We've also been able to prioritise psychological support. And what we were finding was that senior doctors weren't phoning the colleague wellbeing line, which is available for all colleagues. And senior doctors were particularly worried about ensuring that it was confidential and that their name wasn't going to end up on a spreadsheet. So we have managed to secure some additional psychological support where a colleague can self-refer themselves. I don't get to hear names, I just purely have numbers at the end of each month. And that has been really well used by our senior doctors. So it was really interesting that they were very worried about using services. And I think we just need to recognise that in some cases doctors are different. We also have a similar setup for juniors. So you may remember that we talked about the cycling team who arrived at the beginning of the Tour de France in peak fitness. Sadly, the NHS did not start the response to the COVID-19 in peak fitness. And one of the things that we were working on last year was that we done some research in January 2018, using abbreviated Maslach's burnout inventory, which in part helped to kind of prioritise doctor wellbeing across the trust. And we found that 49% of senior doctors were at high risk of burnout. And I just wanted to reflect that actually we really need to remember this when we think about going into a recovery mode, when eventually we're able to step back from the acute response. And I just wanted to highlight, it's just slipped off the thought, this excellent report, Michael West's report, Caring for Doctors, Caring for Patients. And it talked about thinking about prevention. And what we all know as doctors is we like to have autonomy and control. We like to have a sense of belonging and support, but we also get a huge amount of doing a good job well. And I would really commend this to you, thinking about, because it certainly framed some of our strategies alongside our own research, which very much matched that. And thinking about, again, probably jumping the gun a bit in terms of recovery, but I think if I think about the 3 things that I've learned about how to try and help prioritise colleague wellbeing across the DGH that perhaps wasn't totally on board with things a few years ago, but is certainly on board with things now, is that data is really helpful. Our own local data added to the national data was certainly very helpful. Executive support, having the conversations with each of the execs to ensure that they understand the importance of colleague wellbeing. Our chief financial officer and our chief operations officer, when you start talking about productivity and cost, utterly get it. And communication as well, internal and external. So my final slide is a strategy breath. And I hope that it's familiar to you, but I would just ask everyone to follow the instructions. So we're going to breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. And just think about one change that you might be able to take back to your workplace. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really great talk with some strong messages and a bit of insight into how to get engagement with your organisation. I'd now like to introduce Fiona Kelly. Fiona Kelly is a consultant anaesthetist and intensivist at the Royal United Hospital in Bath, has been airway lead, faculty tutor, for ICM in Bath and Deputy Training Programme Director. And she also instigated the Bath Tea Trolley training method, which lots of you will be very familiar with. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you very much. So, Anna, as Tay said, my name's Fiona Kelly, consultant in anaesthesia and intensive care medicine in Bath. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I'd like to talk about practical ways to improve organisational resilience. So I've got no conflict of interest. I thought I'd start off by running through some definitions and then look at ways which I think we can improve our organisational resilience with some lessons I think we can learn from the military, looking at a pyramid of resilience, and then briefly running through our experience in Bath of TRIM. Then to finish off, I've got some practical strategies which you might like to try if you find yourself dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic event. So just to clarify before I start, this talk is not about 2 things. It's not about telling healthcare staff they have to be more resilient. And it's not about using resilience training as a sticking plaster for an underfunded NHS. So moving on to some definitions. So a simple definition of resilience would be bouncing back from difficulty, but I prefer this one here, the ability to prepare for and recover readily from adverse events or challenges. And it's important because at the end of the day, our jobs are difficult and it's inevitable that we're going to come across traumatic events, difficult situations to deal with during our careers. I'm sure we'd agree, no more difficult situation to deal with than the current COVID-19 pandemic. So looking at ways of improving our organisational resilience, I believe that there are 4 lessons that we can learn from the military. First one would be going back to the Falklands War in the 1980s, and I'm hoping that my mouse is going to work. So at the end of the conflict, there were a large number of UK armed forces stationed in the Falklands who need to be returned home as quickly as possible. And about half of the troops were flown home within the next few days or so. But the other half couldn't fly home straight away. They had to sail home the Royal Navy battleships that were stationed in and around the Falkland Islands. And a surprise finding about 5 to 10 years later was that the troops who have flown home had a much higher instance of mental health issues, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so the military called in some psychologists and psychiatrists to look, and they said, this isn't actually such a surprise. The troop who had sailed home had a chance to debrief, decompress with their peers. And these are all people who had very similar, if not nearly identical experiences. And they arrived home in a much better frame of mind. And so this has meant that the armed forces now have a change in their protocols. After a tour of duty, the troops always go to a neutral site for a period of decompression before returning home to their family and friends. So the second lesson comes from the Second World War. And about 15 years ago, I think the BBC decided to make a documentary about veterans from the Second World War who had experienced nightmares and flashbacks following that war. And they put out a press release and asked veterans to write into the BBC, giving as many details as possible. And then one of the researchers at the BBC picked out the most interesting of those letters and invited those veterans in to speak to them. And again, another surprise finding was that almost all of those who came in to speak to the researchers said that their nightmares had stopped since writing the letters. A third lesson comes from who the armed forces would consider a traumatic event. And I've got a video to play, and I'm hoping this is all going to work. Check this out.
Whoa! Holy shit!
Okay, so that truck wasn't actually hit by the landmine, but just assuming it had been, then the armed forces would think about who would be affected, and they would think firstly about those in the immediate vicinity, so the truck immediately in front of that convoy and the truck immediately behind the explosion. And troops in those trucks could be thinking, that could have been me, or they might be thinking even, why wasn't that me? But they wouldn't stop there. They would think much more widely. They'd cast the net a bit wider and think who else could be affected, not directly in that convoy of trucks. So it might be staff in charge who are supervising from a distance, staff who had deemed the day before that the staff who should have been there, so troops who could have been injured in hospital or on compassionate leave, and of course close friends of those who are affected. And then the fourth lesson I think we can learn from the military is that of TRIM. So Neil Greenberg's just talked about that. He's actually one of the original team who thought of the idea of TRIM in the military back in the 1990s and put this in place. So in part, I feel slightly silly about talking about his big project, but I've got no conflict and I feel I can give you a nice independent overview. So as Neil said, TRIM's a peer support tool, and it involves frontline troops being trained to become TRIM practitioners. So this is important. So it's members of the team that are given this extra training. They're not psychologists or specialists in this field. They're the members people working on the front line on the battlefield, and they've got three main roles. So if there is a traumatic event, such as that truck being hit by a landmine, then they're there at the time and they're able to have a psychological savvy conversation, as Neil was saying, with the people affected. Then, in the next few hours, few days, few weeks, they're able to watch out for their team, look for signs of distress amongst them, this sort of strategy of watchful waiting that Neil was talking about. And they're able to provide reassurance, explain to their colleagues that it's normal to feel shook up after such an event, and things will get better if they're kind to themselves and with a bit of time. But if with a bit of time. And then they would check in probably a bit more formally at 3 days and at 30 days and 3 months. And at 30 days I put in red because that's the key time. And you would hope that people were quite affected after something like that they'll be feeling their symptoms would be improving between 3 days and 30 days. And it might be that those people might then benefit from additional psychological support, but that everybody else hopefully would be able to be kept working on the front line in conditions of high stress. So those are the 3 roles of TRIM. Just a couple of definitions which might be helpful. So trauma stress reaction is common. It's a normal reaction to abnormal event. It's more rare. It can follow a traumatic event, and it's shown that early intervention can reduce severity. I think it's fair to say it's a very variable reaction to the same traumatic event. So some staff, if you expose one team to an identical traumatic event, some staff have a very strong reaction and some staff will be very much less affected. And trying to work out who would be more affected, who would be down at this end of the spectrum. It's known that it tends to be those people who are closest to the danger, those who are in charge, who've got responsibility for other people other than themselves, those who've had a previous similar experience, and those who've got other things going on in their lives at the time. The thing is that it's really difficult to predict who will be most affected. And I think this is where TRIM really has its big benefit, because it assumes that everybody who experienced that traumatic event might be affected. Everyone is then looked out for by their TRIM practitioners, this watchful waiting strategy. And if anybody's struggle, they're picked up by that system. They don't assume that only particular people might be affected. So I'd say the advantages of TRIM are that it's peer delivered, it's proven to work, as opposed to, as Neil was saying, a blanket debrief, psychological debrief strategy, which can worsen outcome. On the battlefield, under high pressure conditions, I'd say that armed forces have a moral and legal duty for this towards their troops, but also has got big financial advantages, and Anna was alluding to this: reduced sick leave, reduced performance-related issues, reduced retention of staff. And this review by Deloitte showed that for every this was looking for every pound invested in proactive strategies such as TRIM had a £9 return. So significant financial advantages here. I think really importantly, it destigmatizes mental health issues, because the TRIM practitioners are members of the team and they're working alongside their colleagues. It's been shown to build a resilience workforce, looking at the adage that prevention is better than cure. The idea is to improve team awareness before a traumatic event occurs. And as they say, embedding principles in time of peace brings benefit in time of war. So that's a little brief summary of TRIM. Then looking at the pyramid of organisational resilience and how to improve, looking at how we can improve that in healthcare. So I believe it's got 3 different bits. So the firm foundation at the bottom, designing safe systems. Then on top of that, wellbeing initiatives, and on top of that, crisis management tools. I've always been taught that the design of safe systems, the most important bit, and again, this is following on from Neil and Anna's talks, and that if we can get that bit right, then everything else will follow in place. So by design of safe systems, I mean designing safe working practices, designing safe working environments and education and training, building that firm foundation. I've just got, I think this is important. I'm just going to quickly run through one slide about each of these. So looking at working practices, this is all very relevant to our pandemic, I realise, of course. Looking at staffing, numbers, skill mix, ability to cope with a surge in clinical demand, but also things like rota design, induction, leave, identifying sick patients, voicing concerns, and culture. Looking at, again, highly relevant to the current situation, bed numbers, total numbers plus ICU beds, and again, ability to cope with surges in clinical demand. But just following on from what Anna said, rest facilities, food and drink, PPE, and importantly, things like car parking, bike racks, having enough scrubs, lockers, showers, and importantly, education and training. Again, following on what Neil and Anna have both said, making sure we've got suitable training for the role with protected time, a good system of educational supervisors and mentors to look after the team, and a system in place for supporting staff, either with the employee assistant program. I would put TRIM in this design safe systems, the firm foundation bit. Then wellbeing initiatives. So I'm not going to talk more about this. Anna's covered that beautifully. And then finally, crisis management tools right at the top. Strategies for managing the aftermath of a potentially traumatic event. I'm going to go through that at the end of my talk. Okay, so just having a briefly talk about why I've been interested in this. Why do we have TRIM in Bath? So it all started a fire, which you may well have heard about. I've talked about it at length. Back in 2011, I was consultant in charge. I didn't take this photograph, but our unit looked exactly like this at the time. All caused by an oxygen cylinder which caught fire as it was turned on. And I felt we were really lucky, our team. We were looked after really well by the clinical psychologists in our hospital. This is me here. I was admitted with smoke inhalation along with our nurse in charge. But every member of the team was seen by Mike, one of our psychologists, in the hospital before they went home. He came to see me here on the ward, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they followed us up over the following weeks and months, and actually even until the inquest, which was a year and a half later. And they said they used the first principles of good psychological practice and looked after us really well. And following that fire, the psychologists and our employee assistance program decided to put a TRIM system in place. So one of the psychologists had worked in London during the 7/7 bombings, and she'd heard about TRIM from the military there. So they set up their own system, doing their own training, actually, training up frontline clinicians as TRIM practitioners. We think we might be the first hospital in the UK to do so, using TRIM as exactly the same sort of principles as in the military for healthcare. And that's reaped huge rewards. So the pandemic starting last year, obviously going into this year, I think we had good baseline awareness going into that pandemic, and would certainly say TRIM's never been more useful than it has in 12 months. So last minute or so of my talk, just some strategies for which might be useful if you find yourself dealing with a potentially traumatic event at work. So my suggestions, I've got 6 of them. So I would suggest if you find yourself in a situation, do an immediate team debrief. Gather your team at the side of theatre or go into the anaesthetic room or the next door bay in your ICU or ED. Introduce yourself. Keep it really short, 2 minutes at maximum. Thank everyone for everything they've done. And then explain what happened in 1 to 2 sentences. So, for example, I got called into theatre last week and I said, at the debrief, I think this gentleman had a cardiac arrest because of an anaphylactic reaction to ticaplanin given at the beginning of his total hip replacement. I would suggest if you found it difficult as a senior clinician, then it'll really help the team if you say so. Explain it's normal to feel shook up in this situation. Suggest everyone stops work, everyone goes and has a cup of tea in the coffee room, and give yourself as a point of contact for the next few days or weeks. My second suggestion, write a list of staff. So you really need to do this straight away. It is possible to do it in retrospect, but quite difficult. You need, we make it the responsibility of the most senior doctor and nurse present. You really need first names as well as surnames. Molly, the HCA, makes it a bit tricky. Suggestion 3, if you have a TRIM system, then make a TRIM referral. So we do that by emailing that staff list to all, to our TRIM team in the hospital, and they do the rest. They send out this post-incident handbook. They'll organise all the follow-up. But if you don't have TRIM in your system, you can still remember the TRIM principles. So trauma stress reaction is common and normal, usually gets better with self-care, but seeking having problems does prevent problems in the long run. Look out for staff who might be affected. Remember to watch out for the quieter members of your team. This suggestion, remember the lessons in the military I've talked about. So suggest staff don't go home straight away. Encourage them to talk to other people involved, somebody that they trust, and suggest to staff consider writing a Word document down if they feel it will help. So just for their own use, including everything that happened, their feelings, their fears, their worries, but keep it for their own use only. And my last suggestion, if you look out for your team, you'll find that they'll probably look out for you too. So in summary, my take-home message is traumatic events are inevitable in our fields of work. Organisational resilience puts strategies in place to hopefully avoid problems in the first place, help staff prepare for and recover from traumatic events. I think there are many lessons we can learn from the military. I'd say TRIM is a concrete strategy that's proven to work. And I've run through a few suggestions for dealing with a potentially traumatic event. So I know some of you might be listening to this and think, oh, it's not really for me, all of this. And if so, then maybe look at my last slide. It's from Richard Branson. It's written about business, actually. And he says, clients don't come first, employees come first. If you take care of your employees, then they will take care of the clients. And I think this is relevant to healthcare too. I think that if we, as senior clinicians, take time to look after our team, then they'll be in a better place to look after our patients. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Fiona. I really enjoyed that talk, and thank you to all of our speakers. So we've got a little bit of time now to ask some questions. So if the three speakers are ready, there's loads of questions coming in, so it's quite difficult to choose them. But I suppose the first one to the panel is really that frank preparation is clearly helpful. The first question, part of that is, are we doing this, and are we doing this properly? But is there any role at all for debriefing? And if so, what does that look like, and how should we be trained to do that? Do you want to comment first, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. So I can't comment about whether it's being done, because obviously I'm not in an intensive care unit at the moment. But what I do know is that the role of the debrief is important, as long as it's not a psychologically focused debrief. So the idea of what happened, who did what was going on, led by the supervisor or team leader, is a really good thing. It helps people make sense of what's going on and what they've done, and hopefully helps people realise that they're not alone. They're having probably difficulties that other people are having. And that's something that should be done by the supervisor or leader. What you don't want is someone like me coming in, starting to talk about how terrible it was and the psychological aspects of things, not in the immediate aftermath, because that's been shown not to be helpful and cause harm. So yes to a debrief done by a team leader, looking at practical elements and sharing experience, but no to a psychological debrief, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And Fiona?
Yeah, so I think I'd echo everything that Neil says. So I've been doing quite a lot of work with the Intensive Care Society around this, with Julie Highfield, their lead for Wellbeing. We've come up with a one-sheet team instant debrief that we use, and it's laminated and on the walls in all our theatres and in intensive care. And if something happens, you could pull it off the wall. It's a little, can run through the various things to say. I've sort of said in my talk, and it means that if your head's in a spin, you're not quite sure what to say. So many of my colleagues have said, I don't know what to do in this situation. Then we found this has been helping our teams to do like a 2-minute debrief, and also to get a list of names down at the time, because if you don't do it then everyone disperses, and it can be quite challenging to put that list together later.
And it allows you to kind of follow them up for
exactly, yes, and including people who you might not think affected. So we've had incidents where I remember there was a cardiac arrest in an anaesthetic room where a patient was being handed over to the ODP, and the most affected person was our theatre orderly. And because we got a list of staff down who was, everyone present, we managed to follow him up, and we picked up the fact that he was really upset. But otherwise, we might have missed him, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Fantastic. Anna?
Yeah, just really to add, so local colleagues at North Bristol Trust have devised a really fantastic Start Well, End Well package, which I would also just commend to people alongside the ICS updates as well, which looks at the beginning of the shift and the end of the shift.
Some good resources there then, thank you. So the second question I was going to ask is, how do you go about getting appropriate rest facilities like coffee areas and sleep areas made available? So I thought maybe we'd start with Anna on that question.
So we're really lucky at Somerset Foundation Trust, because we have the very fantastic Phil Shelley as our head of services. And so we have basically had to learn to be adaptable. So during the spring, and in the Southwest, we didn't really see the same volume of COVID as many have seen elsewhere. During the spring, we were able to quite rapidly change training rooms into wellbeing spaces. During the autumn, we have had to be much more creative. And looking at spaces that aren't being used because colleagues are working from home or working in different ways, and can we create little pop-up wellbeing spaces? Because I noticed in the chat, I think the biggest issue is social distancing. So many of our it's highlighted that many of our coffee and wellbeing spaces are inadequate for the number of colleagues that we have on the wards, and many of the ward spaces, you can get 1 or 2 people in. We're also looking at a marquee, but the space that I'd allocated to put a marquee outside, unfortunately, is now turned into a vaccine hub, which is great. So I think being flexible and very much using your estates and facilities team to help you to do that. Moving forward, I think if we're looking at building new hospitals and new spaces, then we absolutely need to incorporate colleague wellbeing space as an absolute priority. And I also think colleague wellbeing space out of the public eye. So we share our dining facilities with our patients and families. And I really think that there is a need to also have some colleague wellbeing space and eating space where you can eat away from the patients and families that we're looking after.
So it's a bit more safe and yeah. Okay. And Neil, did you have anything you wanted to add to?
I haven't really got anything to say about how you make it happen, because I guess that's about having the right sort of people in your environment there who can make these things. But what I do know is actually at the end of the first wave, when things did get better for a little while, as some of the trusts began to say, well, we need to get back these sort of private suites. We haven't got the space for staff. That had a disproportionate effect. And once you give these things, taking them away doesn't just get you back to baseline, it actually goes below baseline. So I think very carefully about, removing these things. And if you're going to do it, have to do it in a very sort of safe and well communicated way, because it can actually make a much bigger impact than managers might realise.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Fiona?
I'd echo what Anna said. Yeah, I think our postgraduate medical centre has been really good at creating extra wellbeing areas. And in fact, I think thinking laterally is also good. Because we've had no family coming into the intensive care unit, we've converted our family discussion room into a quiet room for staff to go to, and the family waiting rooms being another one. So I think what Anna says, actually, when we're building new hospitals, need to be incorporating that into that. But in the meantime, just trying to think sideways, I suppose.
We've had lots of difficulties in our own hospital in getting rest facilities, both sleeping and coffee areas. And I wondered if actually maybe we were doing too much of the stabbing in the front that you mentioned in your talk, Anna, and maybe we need to be more diplomatic in the way. The next question is, how do you engage or deal with people who are malignant energy, who are willfully obstructive and suck the energy from the team? And I wondered if I could start with you, Fiona. You've done a huge amount of work around teamwork, and obviously your trim work focuses on that as well.
Could you say that again, Tay? Say it again. How do we deal with team members?
Or engage or deal with people who are malignant energy and who willfully obstruct and suck the energy from the team.
I think that's hard. I think the first thing is just try to talk to that person and find out what's going on. Is there something going on in their home life that's making life difficult? Is there something specific with the work they're doing at the moment that's making things hard? There's probably something behind it all, and try and explore exactly what's going on. I think then talk with them as to how we can make their life easier. If is there anything specific that can be done? I think that's hard. I don't think there's any magical solution to that. I'd be interested to see what everybody else thought.
Really difficult. And Neil, did you have any comments?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Fiona says, in the sense that the question is what's going on here, because if someone is malignant and difficult all the time, then either they might have, for instance, a post-traumatic stress difficulty, so irritability can be a feature of post-traumatic stress. If it's been going on for 20 years, the whole time they've been there might be something to do with their personality. But I certainly wouldn't ignore it. And at the very least, if they're trying to, in theory, argue for the rest of the team, then actually having a conversation and listening to their need, listening to what they tell you, and then actually helping them perhaps see that what they're doing isn't helping the rest of the team could also make a positive difference. But I would agree, start by asking them what's going on for them, and giving them a damn good listening to before getting to a solution which involves telling them to shut up.
Thank you. And Anna?
Gosh, no, I guess with my coaching hat on, I'd probably do a bit of a Nancy Klein time to think, and just just ask an open question and just sit and listen, because often people who are angry have sometimes forgotten the reason that they're angry, but they just go into fight mode and they themselves aren't listening. And sometimes it's because we're trying to solve or answer the questions that they're saying rather than really getting behind the meaning of what it is. So I think sometimes angry colleagues usually talk loudly, talk long, and just sitting and listening to what they're saying to try and unpick it. But thinking about, it's radical candor, isn't it? It's high challenge, high support. I think the important thing is someone talking to the colleague, rather than what more often happens is everyone talks about the colleague, or even worse, starts having meetings without the colleague, because then things get done. And then those angry people becomes just so much more challenging. So yes, inclusive and talking to.
Yeah, I know, that's fantastic. Thank you. I wonder if we could sneak in just one more question. We are out of time, but I was wondering if you wanted to summarise what your recent paper that was in occupational medicine says, and what you think we should do next, Neil.
Okay, so very briefly, we looked at 709 staff across 9 ICU units. We think we got a response of about 25 to 33%, so it's not too bad. We found really high rates of mental ill health measured by self-report measures. These were anonymous questionnaires, so people should have been honest. We found rates of 40% of probable PTSD. Now, we're not for a moment suggesting we think 40% of staff have a clinical need for PTSD treatment, but we know even when we adjust the thresholds we use that there is a significant proportion. And those rates are really high compared to returning war veterans who have left the military. The rates there are 17%, or the general population is sort of 4.5%. So what this says is actually that this should both be a wake-up call for NHS executives at all levels, but also I think a wake-up call for people working in intensive care that you're not alone. So if you think I've got a mental health difficulty and I feel stigmatized, no one's going to understand me, you're wrong. Actually, there's lots of people just like you. And so I really hope that the message that should be getting through is all the resources that are available locally that you've heard about today, which are fabulous, but also the NHS People resources that are freely available on the NHS People website. Why not reach out and use them if they're out there? I think we should be doing all the stuff we've been talking about, making sure supervisors can have those meaningful conversations, looking at peer support, and also looking at what's called reflective practice, which is, periodically when there's ever a moment, be it 10, 15 minutes, talking about the emotional impact of what's happening, so you can come up with some sort of understanding that it's not me being wrong or my boss not giving me the right stuff, that actually we're in it together and we're doing our best in challenging times. And then the last thing the paper sort of leads on to is really about people who do need treatment. We need to make sure that there is a priority provision for them so that they don't wait months and months and months, because that's not morally right. And also we need to get them back to work as well. So I think there needs to be a priority treatment in the same way there is for veterans under the military covenant for NHS staff who've been affected by the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Fiona, did you want to comment?
What Neil says, actually, we were one of the hospitals that took part in that study, and so our staff, thank you very much to them for filling in the questionnaires. I think thank you to Neil for his work.
And Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely food. It's definitely food for thought, and I think anything that we can use it to evidence base how we frame our recovery phase once we're through it, I think is really, really important.
Okay, so thank you very much to our 3 speakers. I really, really enjoyed that session. I've learned lots, and I'm going to hand back to Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Tay. Thank you, Neil, Fiona and Anna. A really, really powerful session, which was listened to by over 700 delegates live. And they've gone away with some really strong messages there, opportunities to change and do things to support themselves, their colleagues and their departments. Wonderful session, and I'm sure it's going to get a lot of watches in the future. Thank you very much.